Welcome everybody to the July board of NHS Direct, NHS Trust. This follows directly on from our AGM, so that's probably why, if people are watching online, because we look a little bit wearier than we normally do at the beginning of a board meeting. Roger's dissenting actively on that. No, we still look. You think we still look bright and breezy and bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. It just gets better and better. Excellent. Yes, it just gets better and better. Very good. So I'm just going to repeat the apologies that we had for the AGM. So Tim Heyman, Sue Hunter on holiday, Brian Gaffney probably also, and Ruth Rankin is not very well. I haven't had any declarations of interest from for the agenda today. Don't think there's anything yet. No, I think Steve's on a call. So having said that Ruth's not too well, Nick on the other hand is bursting with health, having come back from his holiday, and we have the executive team has put together this month's board agenda and papers under the guidance of Ronette Lucraft, the Chief Operating Officer, who's been ably standing in for Nick while he's been away. So if things are slightly...
If they're wrong, I'll take the blame.
Yeah.
But when they're right, I think the credit goes to Trevor, who took responsibility for pulling together the papers.
Well, I think
teamwork.
Yeah, I think team effort is the bottom line is team effort. Things may be slightly less perfectly smooth than normal, but I'm sure we can cope with that. Okay, and for people who are watching the meeting online, if I could remind you, first of all, that it's a working meeting, not a performance, so we do our best to give you a good experience, but really we're here to do the business of the Trust, and you're watching. And secondly, having said that, if you can complete a feedback form, that would be very, very helpful for us in continuing to improve the online experience. Okay. Let's then look at the minutes of the meeting that was held on the 27th of June. Are there any matters of accuracy with the minutes?
Could I just have my acting corrected, please?
Oh,
yes.
Sorry about that.
Quite right.
Very good. I think we'd be delighted to correct that.
Me too, thank you.
Steve?
Sorry, just to note that I was present at the meeting.
Yes, you were present at the meeting. I think that's been corrected in the formal record. Good, okay. Anything else on the minutes? No, then let's move on quickly to the action log. So we'll have the man of action, Nick Chapman, introduce that.
So there are two items. I'm thinking that the first, Tricia can report on the trajectory, whether it has been distributed to board members. It has, yeah. Is there anything else you wanted to say about it, Tricia?
The trajectory does say month-on-month improvement until November, when we'll reach the target of 8%.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, good.
And I believe the second item on a similar trajectory for health and symptom checker usage was included in the seminar on health and symptom checkers.
Yeah.
So I think that item is
excellent seminar.
Signed off.
Louisa.
I have a quick question about in the minutes, because it's not on the action log, is the provision of insourced managed services for handlers and nurse advisors, which was the report that was taken off of the board. I just wondered if that was going to come back.
Yes, it's coming back in the private part of the meeting because it's commercially sensitive.
Okay.
So it is coming back today.
Should have.
So the reason it's not on the action log is because it's in today's
That's
papers.
provision of insourced advisor managed services.
That's
Got
it.
Yeah.
So it may have changed its title slightly.
No, I
but,
didn't actually connect the two when I was reading it.
Fine. All right. Trevor.
I have one matter arising that wasn't on the action log, and that's under 723 of the minutes. At the last meeting, I asked for a progress report on the action taken following the internal audit report on the completion of sickness records. I noticed the way the minutes been drafted, that's been dropped into a seminar in September. It struck me that that issue is sort of more significant than that, so I wonder if we could hear what progress is happening.
Yes,
No,
Roger will.
It's in my report, which I'll expand on, which is now in the private part of the board. So if I'll pick up that and the other two actions, in the private part of the board, if that's okay, Chair.
Yeah, I think that would be good.
Can I just clarify though? My recollection is exactly the same as yours, Trevor, which is that we will have a board seminar on the subject of sickness, but that in advance of that we would provide an update against the actions on the audit report.
Okay.
All right. Anything else on actions or matters arising? No. Okay. So let's then move on to item 5, which is my recent engagements. I'm afraid there was a slight hiccup, and the version that went into the papers that went out to the non-executive, well, or to the entire board, wasn't the correct version. So you should have a correct version in front of you now. I don't think there's anything particularly to comment on, but I'm happy to take questions if there are any.
Thank you.
Brunette.
Excuse me.
Who is Adam Robson?
That was in the wrong version of the...
Oh, is it? Right, okay.
All right.
And in terms of your discussions with Nigel, was this part of his...
Yeah, unfortunately I wasn't there, hence it was
okay.
again in the wrong
Sorry.
version of the paper. So that was, in fact, Nigel's leaving do.
Leavings do, yeah.
And I wasn't in London and wasn't able to go,
Oh, I see.
so that's why it shouldn't have been on the list.
Right, okay.
Okay. Fine. Let's...
The second one is still wrong as well. That'd be my fault then, because as we established earlier, I had to check these papers before.
Stop digging.
Well, I'm multi. Yes.
All right, so we'll move on. And we'll make sure that the correct version of the Chair's recent engagements is up on the web. Let's go to the Chief Executive's report.
I'll just correct that I didn't hop off my bicycle and write this report, but I'm happy to be accountable for it. The first item I'm actually going to hand over to Roger, but we have launched a significant consultation. That consultation does not, of course, prejudge action that will arise out from that, because given the scale of the potential changes, a decision of that sort would be vested in the board and the board alone, and that will come back to the October meeting. But Roger, perhaps you could say a bit more about the nature of the consultation and the process that we're going through.
Yeah, so you've received a proposal, and that was converted into a staff consultation document, which we discussed in detail with about a dozen staff side representatives at a workshop last Wednesday. And following that, we formally launched the consultation with an email from Renette to all frontline staff, which coincided with the National Joint Partnership Forum meeting on Thursday last week, so that's the 21st of July. I will send out to you following this meeting both the staff consultation document and the launch pack that went with it and some associated documents. And what I will do is arrange probably telephone one-to-one meetings with each of you over the next 2 weeks, so that you are well briefed in the rationale, the process, and what we expect from the consultation, so that when you engage with colleagues in contact centres, you have a very, very good idea of what the basis of this is and what you can anticipate in the sorts of conversations you might have with people. A 90-day consultation, the three principal areas that we are addressing are the standard working practices, which are really no longer fit for purpose for a service that is moving towards 111. Secondly, the number of individual restrictions. Nearly half of our frontline staff have individual restrictions to the hours when they can work. We need to review those, and we need to develop a new flexible working policy which can robustly address issues of flexible working following the consultation. And we need also to review the roster options that we introduced 10 months ago in the light of another 10 months experience, and also in the light of the advent of 111 services. So those are the three groups of issues that we're going to be discussing with staff. We've got the first collective consultation meeting this Wednesday, when we will set out the arrangements for the consultation. We are engaging with all our frontline staff in group and one-to-one meetings, as well as having the collective consultation at the centre. So following your briefings in the next couple of weeks, what we may well do is arrange a board seminar for towards the end of the consultation period. We won't commit to that at this stage, but that was certainly very effective when we reconfigured the first line managers, and that led to a much more comprehensive understanding throughout the organisation of what we were doing. So that is certainly something that we will consider very seriously this time. So unless anybody's got any questions.
Trevor Jones has a question. Let me just endorse what you were saying at the end. We had a really important consultation about remodelling our workforce, and I think one of the things that helped that go as well as it did was the fact that the board had a sort of structured way of engaging through the consultation. And if it's not a seminar, then something which will fulfil that function would be really very helpful. Trevor.
Yeah, it was a comment rather than a question. I chaired the panel which heard a recent collective grievance around some of these issues.
Yeah.
There were lessons to be learned from that, I think, and particularly thing I mentioned is that we need a very, very clear record of the consultation process, showing issues that have been discussed and those areas where there is agreement and perhaps support or not from the staff organisations.
Okay.
So Trevor, we for this consultation, again mirroring the first line manager consultation, we are appointing a central team, a project lead, a full-time HR person, a full-time comms person, and 2 admin people, and it will be their role to ensure that everything in the consultation is recorded, from the collective meetings to the group meetings to the one-to-one meetings.
I mean, it is not surprising, I think, that we are in this situation. We are an organisation whose core service is having to change, and is being changed through central government policy, from a decision that was not made by us. But we have spent a lot of time this morning in our annual general meeting looking at some of the benefits that the new NHS 111 is going to bring to patients and the public. We've heard from some of our staff how much they like it. However, it's going to change our organisation profoundly, and therefore the fact that we have to go through this consultation to change working practices around that is something which, although not something we welcome, we can really understand why that's necessary.
Yeah.
Is that fair? Okay, good. Thank you, Nick. Sorry, Steve, I missed that.
Well, I've just got one question really. I mean, given the fact that any change like this there's bound to be a level of some people will be positive about it and there will be some negativity, how effective do you think our communications is trying to get buy-in with the teams out in the field? But I think communication about what we're about and why this is necessary is really important.
Yes, it's very important. I mean, to the extent that in our discussions between Renette, myself, and the senior operations teams over the last 2 or 3 weeks, one of the ways we intend to strengthen that is to have specialist teams in each division, because I think it's very difficult to rely right down to first line manager level to ensure that some of the really important messages about what our future needs to look like get across. So whilst first line managers will be meeting with their staff, the important communication and engagement elements of this will be undertaken by specialist teams, because we acknowledge that some of these messages still remain around this table, and they have to get successfully right through the organisation, so that even if people don't agree, they understand
The reason why.
Absolutely.
And they'll be given a toolkit, presumably. The individual teams will be given a toolkit.
Yes.
Yeah.
Roger, I'd like to come in and ask a question then.
I was just going to
Do you want to say,
build
yeah?
on Roger's point as well, if I might, is that at the same time that we were holding discussions with our staff side colleagues, we also made sure that we had a thorough discussion with all of our first line managers about what this consultation was about, making sure that they were appropriately armed, if you like, with the right sorts of messages around why we're doing it. And in fact, in my chief operating officer engagement with frontline staff and with first line managers over the last few months, I have been soliciting their views on what we needed to do in order to get into the right place for the future. And so this the need to do this consultation has been in the offing for some time and has been driven very much from the views of a often silent majority who are working additional hours, additional weekends voluntarily at the moment for us, and we want to be able to recognise that as well as make sure that we are fit for the future as well.
Okay, good. I was just going to say that on page 5 of the finance report, not that we need to, everybody doesn't necessarily need to go and look at it, there's a comment about the number of vacancies in first line supervisory roles, and presumably that's one of the things that makes this, that is a to some extent hampers our ability to have that conversation with staff, and that's why Roger, the specialist team, one of the reasons why the specialist team will be important, because we have got some gaps at that first line supervisory level. Would that be fair?
We did have gaps in June, which is when but we've subsequently filled those in July.
Very good.
Of course, those people need to get up to speed and to get to know their team more broadly.
Okay.
So,
but those vacancies have now been filled. Very good.
For the most part, we've got up 4 left.
I think they arose because of the need to transfer team managers into 111 services.
Exactly,
and do that on a non-recurrent basis, and therefore it left gaps.
And it left gaps which we've backfilled by giving development opportunities to people within the organisation, rather than to recruiting any new people from the outside, because it's as Nick says, it's a temporary arrangement while we're delivering the 111 pilots.
Very good. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Anything else on that? Well, obviously that consultation is going to be an important agenda item in the future, and the board will be spending a lot more time on it, both in the meeting and outside of this room, talking to staff about how that is going. Nick?
Very briefly, appropriately moving on to internal communications, and there's a brief update on the additional work that's being done to make sure that we are building on our internal communications efforts. The point I just draw to particularly non-exec directors' attention is the fact that we will be looking to involve you in engagement activities around the organisation over the course of the next few months. So stand by for requests for you to get involved.
Okay.
I was going to say the earlier that we know.
Yeah.
Yes. No. Absolutely. Yes. Well, I'll make sure that we get dates requested in your diaries ASAP.
Good.
Very good. Okay, anything else, Nick, that you wanted? I mean, obviously we've
No,
seen
Pathways
this
accreditation is there, and I wanted to draw the board's attention to a decision that I'd taken. I discussed it with Joanne, but it was my decision to essentially upgrade to the position of Company Secretary, a Director of Corporate Services, so that we are seeking to recruit somebody into a role that would befit a foundation trust. And this will require us to have a greater degree of rigour relating to our corporate governance processes, and that's what this post will fit us to do. Just to reassure the board, I'm not forgetting about the fact that we need to reduce our overheads, and whilst this does represent an additional marginal increase in overheads, it is within the plan for the future, which will see us substantially reduce our overheads. So that isn't too many conflicting adjacent concepts in the same sentence for the board. I'm quite clear this is both needed and that we will make the savings to pay for it.
Thank you, Nick. Any other questions to the CEO, Tim?
Yeah, can we go back to the training accreditation, which I found really interesting. maybe I should know, but who approved us and which organisation undertook the selection?
Renette can do the necessary.
So
A bit more background, please.
yeah, sure. The selection was, so the tender was issued by the Department of Health Informatics Directorate,
Yeah.
which was connected to health in Old Money.
Yep.
And who are the host organisation for the NHS Pathways team. And this came out of an acknowledgement within the Pathways team that they had insufficient scale to be able to internally deal with the high volume of additional training that would be required in order to use their tool, but also wanting to make sure that any training, because it has such an impact upon how that tool is perceived, is undertaken by professional organisations. So they issued a tender to become part of the framework, to which we responded. It was a very, very good response by some of our colleagues within our learning and development team. And as the paper says, we've now been successful in going onto that framework. Key point for us is it means that we can train our own staff without having to get anyone else in. So it's important for our own requirements to become accredited. And if needs be, we can also train other partner organisations as well.
Okay. The two things, if I can follow up, Joanne.
Yep.
I'm not familiar with Advanced Health and Care Limited. Are they purely a trading organisation? Do we know them?
No, don't know.
We don't know them. Maybe I'm wrong, but last time we thought about we know where the North East stands on 111, but I think it was reported that we didn't know where London was going on 111. Is this evidence that they do now? Has there been a change
It's
there?
more to do with pathways rather than 111s per se, Tim, I think.
Okay.
So,
Right.
What London Ambulance Service must have demonstrated to the pathways or the DHID team is that they had sufficient quality in their training organisation to be able to deliver pathways training in the future. Because ambulance trusts like the North East, as well as London, for example, are using the Pathways tool for
Sure.
their general triage
Sure.
for 999, as well as for 111 in the future.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily an indication of one.
No, it isn't. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Very good.
Excellent. Okay. All right, let's move on then into the corporate performance pack. Trevor.
Some financial and performance headlines for the month around these two reports. There were 393 patient and user contacts with the core service in June, plus 532,000 uses of our health and symptom checkers on the web. In total, we've now had nearly 1.2 million contacts with the core service in the first 3 months of the year, and over 1.6 million uses of the health and symptom checkers. Unfortunately, our overall performance levels did decline in June. We had continued challenges to have the right numbers of staff in service at the right times to meet our activity demands. That said, 83% of patients and users did have their calls answered within 1 minute, with less than 4% of users abandoning their call. We delivered our targets for most urgent clinical priorities, dealing with 99% of urgent patients and users within 20 minutes. We dealt with 88% of less urgent and 92% of non-urgent issues within 60 and 120 minutes respectively. And 54% of our telephone contacts did not require any onward referral to other health providers. Our patient and user satisfaction levels remain very good and over 90%. In terms of financial performance, we have a year-to-date surplus of £1.1 million. That's slightly ahead of plan. We have now fully identified our cost improvement plans of £14.6 million for the year, and we are now closely tracking actual delivery against those targets, as well as trying to identify further opportunities and contingencies for any potential shortfall. We had a cash balance of £15 million at the end of Q1. That is slightly lower than planned, and that is due to some SHA payments which have since been received in July. Year-to-date capital expenditure is £266,000, and we have a likely year-end expenditure of £6 million on capital this year.
Thanks very much, Trevor. Questions, anyone? Questions, observations on our performance?
Yeah.
Peter.
I said this to Trevor earlier, but I do find it very reassuring that we are able to look at this financial statement, which is for me more like an integrated performance statement. It's not just finances, it covers everything. And it shows our actions in not only delivering as at the date which this is related to, but also being proactive about thinking about what might happen beyond this period as well. And I'm particularly interested in the fact that we have got the cost improvement programme sorted, but to the extent that also the executives are making sure that they've got a bit of elbow room in this case, just because things may not be delivered entirely. And also knowing where we are with staff numbers. I know you've said that they've changed a bit, but and relating it to the actual performance that we are delivering on, I think is a real step forward for us, genuinely knowing where we are and what we're doing and all those things which you of course expect, but it doesn't always happen. So this, I think, was a very good piece of work, and for me it's about early intervention management, which is necessary in this world of ours, and ensuring that we are continually vigilant about getting it right and getting our costs sorted with our demands. That's no easy thing in NHS Direct, but it's certainly happening, which I am really very pleased to see.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to pick up from that, sort of out of the chair, just as a board member. So I think that I very much agree that the way that this package of information is now presented is exceptionally clear and gives us a sense of insight which has been gradually building over the years, but which takes us to a new level, I think. And as a result, for me, it raised a few specific questions, a couple of which I'd like to quickly run through. I was interested in why, on pages 6 and 7 of the graphs, why volumes seem to sort of be down across the board. So TAL volumes are down, long-term conditions volumes are down, health and symptom checker volumes are down. So on the health and symptom checkers, I was wondering whether those numbers included the app, the mobile application, and they don't.
No.
So that's fine. So that might be part of the explanation. And why is our long-term condition activity so substantially below forecast? Do we know? Is that because we're just not actively recruiting?
And so I think there's the key driver for our long-term conditions activity is our own health contracts, both in Nottingham and in Birmingham. We're not actively recruiting any more patients, and so therefore, as each patient graduates from the programme, which is or our members, we don't call them patients, our members graduate from the programme, then obviously the number of contacts that we have with them will likewise decline.
So presumably we do have an updated forecast because you're managing the resource against that. And would it be better to show
the new trajectory?
The new trajectory as well? No?
I think there's a problem with that. If we keep updating our forecast with what we know now, then what we'll report to the board is that we're always on forecast. So I think there's a methodological difficulty there if we keep changing the target. I'd rather explain why things have changed since the beginning of the year.
We might have a conversation about that separately, because I think showing a reforecast against the original forecast is something which we might sometimes want to do.
I think the other thing on that is that call volumes are not necessarily the best indicator for that particular piece. So if with your leave, I'll pick that up with Trevor and his team about what the right method should be.
Could I just make one overriding point in relation to the long-term conditions, that we are acting in line with the wishes of our commissioners.
Absolutely.
So this is not something that we are doing independently. This is what the PCTs in Birmingham have decided to commission.
And then the TAL volumes, I think that rather than the change month on month, is the big decline in volumes year on year.
Yes,
which
absolutely.
is what we're seeing.
The 25% is the important thing, not the 2%.
Absolutely. And what we think that is indicative of is less use of the Choose and Books service generally, although we have seen we'll talk about this in September, but we have seen a pickup in July of volumes of calls again, but nowhere near as much as what we've had previously.
Is there a switch to self-service?
There is a bit of a switch to self-service because there is a online version, but there's also a switch to self-service where patients are being put through on a direct referral from GP to hospital without going through the Choose and Books system.
Okay, that's interesting. Before I come to Steve, I just wanted to ask one more question, which is about interpreting the graph above. So, I mean, this is a sort of it's a 111 question.
Yes.
We might want to discuss it later on 111 in relation to what we are learning from these sorts of figures about the likely demand patterns for 111. So maybe I won't ask the question now. I'll come back to it when we talk about 111 later on. Steve.
Yeah, mine was on the cost improvement. It was on Appendix 5, which is a cost improvement programme. So I sort of reading this, understand that there's about 8 million, which is really flow on from last year, last year. So I don't really want to have to go back and look at that. But there's about 1.25 million from the Centre Director and also operations.
Could you speak up, Steve?
I'm sorry, but there's about 1.25 million from operations. The question I have really is around efficiencies to match call volume reductions to be identified. Are they still to be identified?
No, that's the wording. At that point, when they were first put into the programme, they were to be identified, but they have been fully identified now.
And they're baked in?
They are baked in, all of these are baked into budgets. Clearly the issue for us is to deliver on that full target, and what we will be bringing through in future reports are delivery forecasts and some risk assessments.
So the 2B is wrong?
So it is wrong and it should come out.
Okay.
That's right. Yeah, I'll make sure that it's for next
Good,
month.
thank you, Tim.
Just looking at page 9 of the finance report, para 6.2, Trevor, maybe I should know this. The third bullet, the change in the method of reconciling and settling KPI penalties with the FHA.
Yep.
Was that expected?
Yes, it was part of the agreement of terms of contract.
Okay, so
this
they
year.
weren't acting unilaterally.
No, it was
That's
all
fine.
part of the contract negotiations and was agreed by both sides.
Peace. Thank you very much.
Very good. Okay, any other questions on the performance package or the finance numbers? No. Okay. Great. Let's move on then to the corporate risk register. Helen, would you like to introduce this?
Yeah. The top 5 corporate risks are those that are identified in the front sheet. Now, these are assessed by what directors feel to be the most appropriately to be brought to the board. Now, you will see from here that it relates to the importance of our value proposition, making sure that we can win and retain contracts, also about having the technical capability to support 111. There are 2 risks in respect of clinical governance. One relates to clinical governance capacity, and also the delays that we're having in giving advice and referral. And the final risk relates to that we are still incurring financial penalties in respect of poor operational performance. Now that relates to existing service delivery. It states that it's a 111 reference, but it actually is in tandem with the 0845 service. So I don't know whether any individual directors want to respond individually, particularly Tricia, in relation to clinical governance. I don't know whether you...
I think Trevor would like to jump in first.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, clearly as Helen's pointed out, this all flows through now from individual directorates, risk registers, right through the executive and into the overall risk register. What we agreed at our last executive meeting was that we would carve out some additional time as an executive to collectively look at the entirety of the risk register. We feel there are degrees of overlap around some of the risks that need to be refined and rationalised. And equally, some of the scoring just need to be revisited and be subject to some peer review and challenge. So I just want to make that clear to the board.
So I'm wondering whether, I mean, do we want to forego a detailed discussion until you've been through that process, unless there's anything anybody feels is, you know, so much a red flag that they want to discuss it now?
Well, can I say, Joanne, thank you very much. When I read this, I found a level of vagueness around it, because what I'm used to seeing is a matrix which shows likelihood and impact.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think if you're going to, as an executive team, get together and agree what the rankings are, but it'd be really good to see that in some sort of matrix, which gives you then a relative.
It's in here.
It's in here. I'm sorry, I apologise.
It's in the bigger pack. No, it's
Okay.
fine. But
Yeah.
the actual scorings are in there.
Yeah.
I think Trevor's point remains valid, which is when one is working in a specific team on a specific project, the risk that you are staring at may seem very large, but when you look at it corporately, it feels smaller. And I think that's reflected in some of the scorings that need to go through that kind of peer review, reconciliation kind of process.
Helen?
I was just say that what Trevor has suggested actually works well in other trusts that I've worked, because I mean that's the issue about making sure that there is a collective viewpoint in relation to our top risk. And so I understand that we're going to carve some time out. Is it at the end of EMB? Would you suggest, Trevor, on a monthly basis?
Yep.
Or maybe an additional time?
And what the board should read from this is that we are making sure that we have got in view the highest risks in the organisation, and that we are carving out the time that's necessary as an exec team to really own and understand the mitigations that need to be put in place. It is almost by definition a slightly painful process, because we're always looking at the cup half empty, or if not even less than half empty, and looking at the gloomy side of the potential risks. So it is a slightly painful activity, but we are engaging in it.
I think it would be helpful when it, just picking up on Steve's point, when it comes back, that that top 5 corporate risks, or whatever you decide is the right number, we ought to have the impact and the likelihood current. So that's, you know, the middle traffic light on the big thing in the summary.
Yeah.
So it's very clear.
Understood.
Good, thank you very much. Look forward to that. So we have got to the end, therefore, of the performance section of the report, unless anybody else has anything they want to say on risks at this stage. No? Okay. I'm going to move straight on then to the next section of the agenda, which is effectively governance and compliance, because the strategic issues are going to be taken in our future work programme steering group later on today. So on the governance and compliance, we have a revisit of our corporate governance manual, which is obviously good practice. Nick, are you going to introduce this?
I certainly can. I think there are a number of kind of good housekeeping type changes to the governance manual that are laid out well by Keisha in the summary. The one that has proved to be of more challenge to try and get right is the issue of what level of bids should come at what level in the organisation for approval. And given the potential for a large number of bids to be coming through, we needed to get this right and not have something that either clogged up the governance proceedings within the organisation or prevented us from being able to be sufficiently nimble through the forthcoming bidding processes, and yet still not delegate out of sight from the board those things that could represent large financial or other risks. So what you have laid out in the relevant excerpt is our proposal to identify 2 different sorts of services, those which are essentially following a standard pattern, which that standard pattern has been, or framework has been through the board governance processes, and simply the application of that framework, unless there is a particular risk associated with that particular bid that raises its profile, will not need to come through to the board for approval, but would be reported after the event. As opposed to bespoke services, which are essentially one-offs, where there would be a much greater degree of scrutiny. And we've tried to capture that in the governance process with limits and with delegated powers. I hope that is clear, but happy to answer any questions on it.
Okay, so Tim, and then afterwards I'd just like to just check with Peter in his audit committee role.
Okay, I'm jumping almost to the next agenda item because this was discussed at the Finance Committee.
Yes.
And what we've also, I mean, you could see that we've had 2 extraordinary finance committees, and they are extraordinary. And so clearly, this bid activity is going to continue. What we've also done, as well as reviewing the levels, which are in the governance manual, we've put in the diary a couple of telephone finance committee meetings as well, interspersed between the more formal ones that are in the diary. So we've got placeholders in the diary so that the proper people have got something available should there be an issue arising. And we can knock those telephones calls on the head, a week beforehand if there's nothing bubbling under, because clearly we are going to get a lot more of this. Well, we hope there'll be a lot more of this activity. But we thought that putting those additional meetings in and changing the levels was a good response to the situation.
Okay, thank you, Tim. So what I take from that is that the Finance Committee's thought quite hard about this and is keeping close and is making itself available to make quick decisions.
Yeah, but I did say we better check this out with Peter as well.
With me personally.
Well, with the Audit Committee, because I felt that we were sort of, when we set up the Finance Committee, we were very sensitive about the interface with the Audit Committee, and I think this is something that sits on the borderline, if you like. So we very much welcome your input.
Trevor, you wanted to come in?
Just to say that an earlier form of this wording was included in the scheme of delegation that was in the revised corporate governance manual that went through to audit, and this final change version has been shared with our auditors. Right. So it has been cleared with them.
That was one of the questions that we would have asked. I'm just wondering whether that Trevor wanted to say he's got something.
I've got a couple of points
he wants to raise first. So.
Okay, do you want to go first then, Trevor? You're welcome.
First point for me is in the sort of the detailed document, the amendment, section A, 486, and it's about the executive management board. My view of the governance structure we have is that we have a board which will take ultimate responsibility for governance of the organisation. We have board subcommittees, which are really about scrutiny and performance review. We have a chief executive who heads the execution of board's decision function. We have individuals accountable to the chief executive who are accountable to the chief executive for anything he decides to devolve to them, subject to SFIs. So I don't agree that the Executive Management Board is a management committee of the board. However, if we agree that the Executive Management Board is a subcommittee of the board, I think it's important that we see terms of reference, composition, meeting frequency, delegated powers, and how it impacts on the reporting arrangements of the chief executive. So I think it clouds the issue.
It's your issue.
I mean, isn't the answer to that why is it in the corporate governance manual?
We're adding it. I don't think we should.
Yeah, I mean, what's the purpose? So I think it's a vital group, and it will be driving our future program and so on. I think the question is, why put it in the governance manual?
Okay. I'm not sure I know the detailed answer to that, but just to knock off a few of the points. First of all, the board has seen and approved the terms of reference and the membership and the delegated powers of the Executive Management Board in the past, but it's a little while ago. But
I've raised this point a couple of times. I don't recall it. I'd like to see it again.
That's fine. Happy to. But the simple point is, I completely accept your point, which is, and it is worded this way, established to assist the Chief Executive. The Executive Management Board and its establishment and reference to it in the governance manual does not water down or make any less sharp my own individual accountability as Chief Executive. So from that point of view, I agree with you, Trevor, and I would want to make sure, I think it is worded that way, established to assist the Chief Executive in the development of.
It's your decision.
But it is my decision and I remain accountable for it. So I don't think it's muddying the water in that sense. Why is it in the governance manual?
Trevor, do you have an
I
answer
might
to
have a
that?
view.
Well, what we've done in terms of governance manual is not only give the transparency of the various groups and committees, but also show in the full document their terms of reference as well. And the point was about being very transparent to anyone looking at the entirety of the document. So, for instance, a regulator, when we're going through some form of assessment in the future, potentially for FT, how do we actually manage the governance arrangements within the organisation at both board level and at an operational level? So that's why it's defined down to that level. We haven't gone beyond that, but it's down to operational management board level.
Okay, so it's basically a transparency point.
But I think the point that we might need to take on, it's not a committee of the board. That's the point.
I think Trevor's right.
So so I guess there are two.
It's an executive committee. That's fine. Accountable to the Chief Executive.
Yes. So let's make that clear, and then let's send the terms of reference around.
Okay.
All right. So it's not a committee of the board.
It's not.
Very good. Well spotted, Trevor.
Can I?
Yeah. Sorry, I
you
think
have
Trevor
anything
had
else?
some more points, didn't you, or not?
It's for Peter as chair of the audit committee. I didn't think when we were setting up the finance committee that the finance committee was to provide assurance on financial matters. I thought the audit committee provides assurance to the board on financial matters. I'm just looking at 484.
I think that's right.
Again, you just get confusing in terms of governance.
That's right. I think
Yeah. Okay. So it's a wording issue. Let's sort that out too.
I would agree.
Okay. So that's agreed too.
Yeah.
Okay, and you'll work out some wording. Fine.
So what is the finance committee established to provide then?
Isn't? Do you want to? Have you got a form of words to hand to him? Otherwise,
Okay,
I'll
you'll
just
have-
have him
okay,
describe.
right, yeah.
Okay. It's to provide more. It's to provide more specific and detailed scrutiny of major financial decisions. Is my understanding of what the finance committee is there to do.
And it picks up commercial issues arising as well.
Financial performance issues.
Okay.
So it's complementary to the audit committee, but it is not taking over the
No,
assurance.
we should not do that
element.
because having two people doing the same thing is clearly bonkers, Peter. I don't think we'd argue on it.
That's fine. And there are two things I just want to say. One is Trevor's answered the point that this has been shown to the auditors and that they are content with it, which I think is very important to note in a minute.
Yes.
And the second thing is, just for me, so I didn't have a problem, I'm familiar with these proposals from the audit committee has had these. The bit that, having spoken about risk just now, I'm just drawn to the bottom of 8 in the 48. 48 at the bottom of this page.
Okay, page 48
Yeah.
of the. So it's an excerpt. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's just a question of the way in which the scoring for the risk gets done, really, for me, because if it's escalated if it gets above 10, and therefore we must have very strong system in place, and I know you've just covered this, of ensuring that is done appropriately.
Yes.
Okay.
And
So
that's the only comment I have.
who's looked at the scoring system for bids, Nick, outside of the bid team, as it were? Because somebody's got a phone on.
Oh, sorry, it's probably me.
Not me.
Okay, so if we could just check our phones and make sure that they're not interfering with the
Fine,
signal, that would be
fine,
good. Thank you very
All right.
much. Let me just take a step back. So Peter's made a very good point, that, as his points always are, of course, that the scheme of approval for bids, which we're happy with, crucially depends on the scoring system that underpins it, because that determines whether a bid comes to be approved. And so we want to. So I think what Peter's asking for is a bit more transparency on the scoring system.
And it's
visibility.
something I think the audit committee should take a view on as well.
So Could we agree that the audit committee take a look at it?
Because I just think it's the way to do it, and then we can come back to the board and say that, no, that's fine. Or
In terms of the mechanism, the reason I was pointing at Susie rudely was that it would be the bid board, which is a multidisciplinary group that's chaired by Susie, that would take the view about the risk assessment for a particular bid.
But according to
what lies behind our general risk management system that we were discussing in the previous item is a risk scoring system on impact and probability from 0 to 5, and which we're aware of, and it's the application of that in a bit more detail to how risks on bids will be assessed that I think you want reassurance about, and that I think the appropriate action is for Ruth/Susie to identify that, to describe it, and then report it through to the audit committee.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Standard framework applied to deliverability, cost assumptions, reputation, impact.
Yeah.
So it's a standard framework. Very good. That's fine.
Thank you for that. Otherwise, I recognise that, and it seems highly appropriate and correct.
Very good, Tim. Rarely has a corporate governance manual generated such interest.
Not often I get my pedantic hat on, but if we're staying on page 48, and the definitions of the bids and where they go to, I mean, we've got A, bids up to £1 million fine, B, bids up to 5 million. Well, I think that should read bids greater than £1 million and less than 5 million.
Okay, why don't we sort that out?
Can you?
I'm not sure
Otherwise, it means that not only bids up to £1 million would have to go to the chief executive as well. Technically, on that wording.
It is pedantic, but you're right.
It should be greater than unless. Yeah. Sorry.
I've read it as a limit rather than as a.
Yeah. Okay, somebody's going to take another look at that and assure Tim that it's right.
Fine.
Or
We'll deal with
change
Tim's
it.
point. Yeah.
Okay, so let me just sum up. Well, let me look around the room and see if there are any other comments on the corporate governance manual. Let me then just sum up what I think we've agreed on it. We've agreed that the executive management group is not, that's the management board, is not a committee of the board, but it remains in the manual, and we'll look at it and we'll share the terms of reference for anybody who's interested.
Yep.
The finance committee is not about assurance. We've agreed that the corporate governance manual will be amended to reflect that, and that the audit committee is going to have a look at the way in which our standard risk framework is applied to bids, just to give us assurance on that, because so much rests on that, and that we're going to check that the way in which the limits are worded in the manual is precisely correct, which will satisfy Tim. And then everybody will be very happy.
Perfect.
Very good. Good piece of work, seriously. Thank you very much for
John,
doing that.
just back on Tim's point, I'm not quite convinced actually.
Okay, so we're not going to have the conversation now. A conversation will be had where the right answer will be in the manual and everybody will be convinced. Thank you very much. No, it's very important that we do this. It's important that we get it right. And my levity aside, thank you. That's good. All right. We've then got, let's see if we can get through some minutes and then we'll have some lunch. So we've got an oral report from the latest Finance Committee meeting, and we also have some minutes from previous meetings which are for the record, having had oral reports from them previously. Tim, what would you like to tell us about your Finance Committee meeting of the 13th of July?
Thank you, Joanne. Very quickly, you've heard already my comments about the extraordinary meetings and substituting phone calls for that. That's in place. We did actually, it was a surprise to me that the Finance Committee has been running for a year, and we did look at our terms of reference as part of good governance to make sure that we got those right. There were, I can't recall the changes, Trevor, but they were pretty minor, I think. But Peter, you might like to have a look at them. But they haven't changed much. But we did review them, which is important. There is an e-learning package that we reviewed, and the Finance Committee decided that all of us would go on the Finance e-learning package. And we did have some speculation about what would happen if I failed it, but there we are. There is an exam at the end, and we commend to the board and selected senior management that they also undertake this finance e-learning package. And so we are suggesting, when you see the minutes, and I'm sorry they haven't been published yet, I've just been given them this morning because I was away last week. So we are recommending to the board that all board members complete the same e-learning package that we're going to inflict on ourselves. And I think that's good practice.
Louise is yawning at the thought.
It'll be almost as thrilling as the information
I was
management.
suddenly thinking, is there a time, what was the time scale? Do we agree a time scale for when we do it? Is that right?
We're working on the programme.
It won't be a burden. It won't be a burden, and it'll be. It won't be.
No, I think it's. I did very well in my last test. So.
Information governance, Louise.
I'm sure you'll be top of the class, Louise.
And
wanted to tell us, wasn't it, actually?
The only other thing of note that I want to really pull out is that the innovation funding from the East of England, it's in the private section of the agenda. So perhaps I'll come back to that.
Yes, why don't you? Good.
Anything to add?
Fine. Thank you.
The only part on the terms of reference was about oversight, being the official group to have oversight of the Our Future.
Oh yes, thank you.
Okay, fine. Good point.
Thank you.
All right. Now, Tricia, you kindly handling the clinical governance minutes from the teleconference on behalf of Sue. Yeah. So, is there anything you'd like to say, or would you just like to take any questions?
I'll just take questions. Thank you, Joanne.
Are there any questions on the clinical governance teleconference or the revised terms of reference? No? Okay, thank you very much. Then I think we can grant ourselves lunch. Is it? Yeah, well, I was just wondering whether to have lunch now.
That's the last thing on the public part, because the service quality reviews our crowd.
Oh, true. Okay, so good point. So we will soldier on.
Yeah. You can hear my stomach rumbling from there.
Sorry?
I assume you can hear my stomach rumbling from there.
Yes. So do I take it then that we can approve the terms of reference to the clinical governance committee? Okay. Do we have to approve that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Steve, are you happy to join the clinical governance committee?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. So we can approve that. Thank you very much. Okay. Good. All right. Well then, let's carry on. So I've only been notified of one. So we're now into the stakeholder engagement section of the public board, which is the last section. First item on the stakeholder engagement section of the agenda is trust board engagement visits, which is when we go out, visit contact centres, talk to staff. I think the only one that we've been notified on is, Renette, you went to Dudley on the 18th of June. I don't know if there's anything from that you'd like to share with us.
I think I would actually, if that's okay. Well, there's been others where I've been doing, as I've mentioned before, first and second line management discussions. But what Dudley was characterised was an opportunity for me to listen to and speak to all of the staff that are involved in the delivery of the Own Health programme. And so I was able to update the staff on what we know at the moment around the future commissioning intentions for that particular programme of work, and to reassure the staff that we would be working with them in order to try to redeploy as many of the staff into other roles within the trust, and that we would be seeking to top up, if necessary, the skills that they have in order to be more redeployable within the organisations, and that we were obviously trying to avoid any redundancy situation for many of the staff that were employed in that what we I strongly, on behalf of the board and on behalf of myself, was a programme that we were very dedicated to. But with the changing commissioning environment, we didn't necessarily see that service would be recommissioned in the next financial year. I was at pains to point out to the staff that this isn't the start of a formal consultation, and that if that was required, then they would be appropriately informed therein. And that the staff also were not at risk at this time, so that, as the board can imagine, there's quite a lot of anxiety on two levels. One, because the staff really value the service that we deliver to our patients.
Yeah.
And then second, but by no means least, the fact that they really enjoy doing this job themselves as well. So a difficult time for a significant portion of our staff, but as I said to them, and the board I'm sure supports, that we want to start the redeployment as soon as possible so that we can assure that everybody who wants a job in the organisation is appropriately trained to have one.
Good, thanks for that. Okay, any questions on that?
I've got one other piece of feedback, and I think Tim Heyman also did an engagement visit to Nottingham, and he and I have discussed, he'll probably want to give it in his own words, but Tim took the opportunity to go to Nottingham by himself to listen to some 111 calls, and he found that very useful from a perspective of his contribution to the Our Future programme in his role as assisting me in the future operations design. And so he had a very good afternoon and evening listening to calls and talking to staff there as well.
Mm-hmm. Very good. I'm sure he'll tell us about it.
Tell him that in more detail, but he did ask me to feedback before. So.
Okay, very good. All right, thanks very much for that. Let's go on to the board call recording. Tricia, well, first of all, let me ask a question. Is there anybody who wasn't able to listen to the... Okay, we've had a couple. All right, so most of us have listened to it. Everyone else around the table heard it? Yeah, no? Susie, you haven't? Anyone else who hadn't? Okay, fine. Tricia, would you like to introduce it?
Yes, thank you, Joanne. The recordings this month were taken back to a number of boards previously, where the request was to compare and contrast GP calls with our nurse advisor calls, and I think the 3 calls you've listened to this month represent those quite well. 2 are GP calls and 1 is a nurse call, and the symptoms are all around patients experiencing abdominal pain. In the introduction, it gives an example of the difference of what a GP is trying to elicit from the patient. The GP's assessment is not supported by clinical software. The GP's process is just to elicit the patient telling their own story. And the nurse assessment is supported by clinical software, and the nurse takes the patient through a journey that is methodical in its assessment of the patient's symptoms. The two calls by the GPs were less than 3 minutes, and I think you'll have all noted the succinct nurse assessment that took place in this process. And I think there were things that were very similar in it, but equally things that were very different as well. I'll keep my own comments on those calls to the last and take questions and comments from the board.
Okay, does anybody have any comments or questions? I certainly do. Trevor?
Just a reflection, taking out any kind of clinical issues, the GP calls felt short, sharp, professional and caring. Very direct, got you there, but in a very nice way. Comparing that with the nurse call, and you shouldn't do that necessarily, it was very clear that the nurse was working to a script, because at times she was talking to herself about what was appearing on the screen, rather than actually talking directly to the patient. That's not a complaint. You could just hear it in what was happening. Because I don't need to ask this question because I know what the answer is almost. So that was just my reflection on the 3.
So I was very interested in understanding what the sequence of calls was. Mm-hmm. So how long patients had waited for the GP callback, and I think Tricia, you may have some information about that. The other thing the 2 other things I was interested in. One was that in neither of the GP's calls did the GP refer at all to any information that had been gathered about the patient. So it didn't say abdominal pain, started with a blank sheet of paper. And the nurse referred to abdominal pain in her call, and I thought that, and I'm not sure why, whether there's a policy difference
No,
there.
there's not a
There's not a policy
policy
difference. And whether we would consider one or the other good practice. Because I suppose my instinctive view would be it's good practice to say, to acknowledge the original call and to acknowledge why the person called. And I think that would be a good thing for everybody to do, whether GP or nurse. The other thing I noticed, it was interesting for me that it related to the dignity and respect topic that came up earlier in the AGM, that the 86-year-old female patient was called dear, and the 52-year-old male patient was called sir. And again, it might have been, that. So there's a question about whether that is to do with the role of the person who was speaking. One was a nurse, one was a doctor, or just the personality of the individual. But I felt I felt a bit uncomfortable about that difference, and I wasn't quite sure. Maybe it's just personal style, but I'm more comfortable. I'm not sure I'm terribly comfortable with either of those. It's just a left question in my mind. Peter, so we'll capture some of these thoughts, Trish, and then we'll come back to you.
I agree with Trevor's comments, so I won't repeat those. The only other the thing on the second GP call, it was quite interesting that he, although it was quite concise, he did get into quite a bit about her circumstances, including being a disabled person, people coming into her house, because he was going to ask her a question saying, can you go somewhere? Can you go to the doctor? And he soon shut his mouth and said, no, I appreciate you can't get there. And but there was a lot of useful stuff that came out of that conversation, which I'm not sure he enticed it out of her, but it's the sort of thing that would be really valuable to know about someone's circumstances, and so that came through. And I just on the nurse call, I felt that the nurse was very empathetic and sympathetic, actually, with this person, and particularly given the pain problems that they had, it was appropriate as well. So, but I hadn't picked up your point about the deer and sir thing. I must.
Louisa.
I thought that I was quite struck by the length of time that there seemed to be. So that it was 2 hours. She's the first one sounds like she's got sort of, some biliary colic or something pretty painful, and she waits 2 hours for a call back, and that's felt to me sort of reasonably long time. The next person is told. She's saying. She sounds pretty stoic, this poor woman, and if she's saying that this pain is the most violent ever, and she's 86, to be told that somebody might visit between 0 and 6 hours felt to me quite long as well. And then this other chap who's previously had 2 pretty major bleeds. I'm not quite sure what happened to him or how long he waited, and it'd be nice to have some sense of maybe finding out.
So they'd bring back in an hour.
Yeah, he got referred to the out of hours for
within
an hour
So
assessment.
within an hour, okay.
Yeah. Within an hour.
Good, I missed that.
But we don't know how long you waited to get his call back yet. But Trish is going to tell us.
Okay, and then it was interesting about the empathy, because at one point when you said about Crohn's, she said, bless you, I'm so sorry, and I felt almost it was a bit too much, almost. Crohn's isn't very nice, but I just wondered whether she was putting something more than she needed to into that.
I think it's finding the right balance, isn't it? If
Yeah.
I could just take it, the net promoter score for the patient was high, and his experience, he said, was a positive experience. And back to being the sir and the dear, both patients reported their engagement with the service as a positive engagement. And I think when we see it as stark as that, you're hearing the 2 calls together, you do pick up those things. I think when you think of the essence of care and dignity and respect, yes, it's an absolute valid point and something we can address, and we do address in our training and of our staff to use terms of endearment appropriately. However, the patient's experience both state that it was a positive
they're both
one.
happy. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. For the patient journeys, on the first call, when the
when the call first rang into the service, they were immediately transferred, though their original call came as a priority as a P2 because the service was performing highly at that time. The call was transferred to a nurse advisor. So the nurse had undertaken her assessment, and then from the end of that assessment she felt the patient needed further advice regarding additional analgesia, and then was put on the GP out of hours queue for West Yorkshire Urgent Care, where they then waited 60 minutes for the GP to call them back.
Okay, so they'd spoken to he was the third person she spoke to.
She spoke to the health advisor, the nurse, and then the GP. And interestingly, when my clinical opinion of this call was, though I haven't heard the health advisor call, then therefore what the patient actually did say, I would have expected in the first instance that patient to have been transferred where the GP originally said and streamed immediately under that circumstance to the accident and emergency department. And interestingly, the patient, her experience was not a positive experience, and she reports that quite clearly there. Her original view was she thought she should attend accident and emergency. She was unsure and was seeking validation of that in our service, and then we sent her on a lengthy journey. She did actually attend the walk-in centre, and the walk-in centre did not have the appropriate skill set.
That was odd, I thought, because I thought the GP was pretty clear about why she should go to A&E.
Yeah, I felt the GP was
it seemed a slightly odd decision on her part to then go to a walk-in centre, having had explained to her what she would need. Okay. And then quickly, the other two journeys, Trish.
Yeah, in the second case, the patient equally was transferred to a nurse as a P2, and then awaited the time scale of 26 minutes before the GP then called her back.
Okay.
And I suppose that's interesting, the time after that to when she was seen, that was all 6 hours would felt quite...
I'll have to come, that's the out of hours provider, I don't know that, but I'll find it, Louisa. And the next one was a call back, Joanne. It was the gentleman had rang back into the service, and it really should have been a P1 priority rather than a P2, because he was still experiencing the same symptoms or no improvement.
So he called the health advisor first,
and then he to a nurse.
And then spoke to a nurse earlier on in the day, who'd advised him to take some analgesia, and unless his symptoms didn't improve or became worse, to call us back. So he was acting on that advice, rang the service back, spoke to the health advisor, was re-prioritised as a P2. Now our current policy in ensuring repeat callers into the service on the day should have been a P1. So
is it definitely though, Trish? Would it that it wouldn't come in as a P3 on the second call?
No, it was definitely I'm sorry. I'd like to report that one in.
All right.
Okay. And then he then waited 15 minutes for the call back from that P2 inquiry.
And do we know how long he waited the first time? Did you say he was warm transferred the first time? When he called in the first time, we don't know.
We don't. I've not got that information. No.
Okay. All right. It's interesting. I mean, Nick. Sorry, you wanted to say something. I'd forgotten.
That's okay. Two points. The first relates to a point we were discussing a little bit before, which is about the outcomes. I found two of the outcomes in the calls very clear as far as the patient, very clear, very specific. I found the first call, the outcome was almost by the way. It wasn't specific, and it actually doesn't surprise me as a result of that the patient did not differentiate between what the doctor actually said, which was A&E, and what they actually did, which is go to walk-in centre, because it wasn't clear, it wasn't actually nailed, in my opinion. So my advice is that you go to such and such a hospital A&E department. It was I thought, a rather vague ending.
Yeah, and excuse me, Nick, I think that's more listening to the detail of his actual comments, because the GP did conclude with you require a face-to-face consultation in an environment where a specialist may be able to see you and admit you if necessary.
Yeah, I agree, but to you and I, who've worked in the health service for a very long time, that means go to A&E, but what is not specific, and is a very, I can imagine a doctor saying that and being absolutely clear that they've been very clear with the patient.
Yeah.
But from a patient's point of view, I think that you should go to St Elsewhere's A&E department. Can you get there okay? Would have been a much clearer outcome.
Actually, he did say to her, I think.
He did say
said,
A&E, yes.
Do you need to take clothes with you? You may need to take clothes with you. Is that what
I don't think I heard that.
Yep.
May need to
I
take
know that he
clothes
left
with
very
you.
quickly to you might need antibiotics into your vein, which seemed to be quite a quick.
It wasn't.
leap.
It wasn't
And then he
specific
said
as to
take
place.
clothes.
That's my point.
Why don't
I
you take clothes to
it's only my
walking
opinion.
centre?
Isn't a court of law. It's only my opinion.
Well, but she is.
Can I mention the second point,
Yeah.
which is, Trish, your report says under 5.1 that under 111 the patient would have been warm transfer. The warm transfer is in inverted commas. I don't believe actually that if the patient had been through an assessment and the result was speak to primary care, that there would have been a warm transfer. In other words, no delay, simply put you through to the doctor. They would have gone onto a list and had a callback. Can you just clarify that?
Well, the specification suggests it should
I know
be,
what the specification says, but in practice, what
It
is
would have gone
happening?
on a queue.
They would have gone on a queue.
Yeah,
Well, I
I'm
think
being told that.
this is a really important point,
Yeah, okay.
that where the outcome is speak to primary care clinician, which it is in 30% of cases,
It will be a callback.
then what the patient experiences is the doctor will phone you back, and there is then a delay between when the patient has that conversation and when the doctor phones back. And we should not ourselves, it's not a question of disguise, but
Disguise it from
we
ourselves.
shouldn't delude ourselves that actually 111 will provide a warm transfer in that situation, because doctors are not being engaged in sufficient numbers to enable there to be the sort of numbers of doctors needed waiting for calls to receive warm transfers.
In the current pilots, however, it is something within the national specification that would be a part of what 111 would aspire to become.
Yeah, but it's an aspiration that is not being resourced.
Yeah.
My final comment is whether board members noticed the volume of noise in the background, particularly with the 2 GP calls. I particularly picked it up. I felt the background of the 2 GP calls was noisy, yet the nurse seemed to be in a cocoon. It seemed to be really quiet, so just an observation.
Could I ask a question about the future? So under the future that we envisage for our service, becoming 111 and so on, will we be employing and or training GPs to take telephone calls?
It's an option available to us.
It's an option.
Okay.
It's not something that we see as being a key part of the future operating model, because we think that our partner organisations, particularly our GP out of hours colleagues, are considerably better at doing that sort of thing than we are.
I guess my feeling from this and from other calls that we have listened to, that GPs are immensely skilled at the fast analysis and decision making, and yet there are some aspects of the way that we do things that could usefully be adopted by GP colleagues, and I think that's an interesting challenge for the future.
I think just to build on that, one of the things when we started to take on the West Yorkshire Urgent Care service, and as part of that we are part of the rotation for GPs in training to get the skills to do remote triage and assessment. One of the things that the GPs use when they first come in, the very first sessions that they do to learn this new skill, is to familiarise themselves with the tools that we use for our nurses. So they use the CSPT tool, which is what's used by our health advisors, and they are also given access to the teleguides. And the GPs, what was reported back to us is they very much appreciate having, when they're first learning this new skill, the support of clinical decision-making support software, although as they become more experienced, then they don't need to rely upon it. But that's also true, I think, of our own nurses, who, the more skilled and experienced of our nurses, will also be able to go through the equivalent of the tool very, very quickly and effectively, and make it not sound scripted, and use the tool for support rather than for a journey through the conversation with the patient.
I think it's very, very interesting. I was thinking specifically of the beginning and end point. So, for instance, whether you do reference back to the original call that the person made and mention what it is they called about, which the GP didn't do, and the clarity of the end point. Being very clear that you have given the patient a specific recommendation with a rationale. And so it's those sorts of things around that decision-making process, which, as I say, I think GPs tend to be incredibly skilled at. Anyway, it's just interesting, and thank you very much, Trish, and your team for preparing those call recordings for us. So if anybody, unless anyone has anything particularly they want to say, in addition about the call recordings, I'm going to note that we're taking our service quality reviews into the private part of the meeting. And that I haven't been notified of any other business. If anybody wants to do any now, no, that's fine. The next public meeting of the NHS Direct Board is going to be in September, on the 26th at 10:30 in the morning here and online. And anybody who's still with us online, could they please complete a feedback form? Thank you very much.